Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into to give you greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. We're going to just do one topic today, which is American politics with regard to just Adam Kinzinger. I wanted to play you an interview on Ukraine the Latest podcast, the Daily Telegraph podcast that produces some really high-level content on the Ukraine war every single day. I listen to it every day, not missed a single episode, I don't think. Or at least not since the beginning of the war. This is, first of all, I guess, let's just talk about this before we go on to Adam Kinzinger. So I was just looking at my Twitter feeds just now, and I've heard that, and I hope this is not true, but my goodness, it wouldn't surprise me. The Oklahoma Republican Party has passed a censure resolution condemning the GOP Senator James Lankford. So I talked about in my previous video that James Lankford is the voice of reason in trying to get a deal done for a border bill, a compromise between the Democrats and Republicans. I mean, that's what you're employed to do as politicians. That's, you go and do deals with the other side and you work out some end result, some bill or legislation that will appeal somehow to both sides who want completely different things, and then you pass that bill and you get stuff done. And unless you just have overwhelming majorities in either house, and then you just easily pass the bills without having to do compromise across the aisle. So here's James Lankford doing that compromise across the aisle, because at the end of the day, you've got 10 months of a country where, you know, the Republican Party has a minority in the Senate, very slim, and a majority, but very slim, in the House of Representatives, and the president is a Democrat. So you are going to need to work together with the Democrats to get stuff done. So he's working in the middle of the kind of the border issues and all of the controversies surrounding that to get something done. And he's in fact pretty much got a bill that has moved the Democrats much more towards the Republicans, as far as I can work out, in terms of compromise. And yet, just because he's deemed to do, politics for the crime of actually trying to get something sorted out with the Democrats, what we want is bipartisan support. What we want is people reaching across the aisle and working together. What we don't want is a completely divided House in the US, where you can never ever do work between the parties. You have two completely different ideologies, and never the twain shall meet. That would be so divisive. You would just get a Congress that barely passes any legislation unless, as mentioned, you have an overwhelming majority in both houses. So for his crime of wanting to work with the Democrats, of ignoring Trump saying no deal should be done on the border until I'm president, which means there's no Ukraine aid until November, which means Ukraine might get stuffed over because of that political opportunism. So Lankford is working really hard and doing a really good job to dramatically increase border security. And then the Oklahoma GOP party says, until Senator Lankford ceases from these actions, the Oklahoma Republican Party will cease all support for him. So he's been censured by his own party, according to that resolution. That is absolutely insane. And it just really depresses me that that's the state of politics in the US at the moment. So Adam Kinzinger, many people will know him. He's a former Republican lawmaker, although he became rather unpopular with those kind of people who have censured Lankford in terms of sitting on the committee that was looking at the January the 6th issue with Trump, etc., and that really lost him his seat eventually. And now he's sort of commentating from outside that bubble. But he is a Republican at heart, although he said he won't vote, I think, for Trump in this next coming election. Anyway, this is what he has to say about the Ukraine war, about US politics, and I think is a very interesting and revealing interview.
Adam, would you give us your take then, your sense of the current state of the Republican Party looking towards the presidential election in November? Are you optimistic or pessimistic when it comes to the potential election and certainly the potential candidature of Donald Trump?
Well, look, I think first off, there's maybe about 6 people in total in the United States that want to see a Biden and Trump rematch, and they're all Biden, Trump, and a couple of their family members. The rest of us are just sitting here shaking our heads saying, how are we back in this position? Particularly on my end, how are we here facing Donald Trump again after January 6th and January 7th? If you'd have come and told me, hey, Adam, guess what? Trump's going to run again, I wouldn't have believed you. If you much less told me he'd be the nominee, I think you were like losing your mind. So, it's this instability. It's the thing I'm trying to grapple with on this side is we have this political instability. We have this kind of deep consternation, this feeling that everything is not right in the population when actually the numbers say otherwise. We have an economy that's doing actually pretty well. It's recovering. We're seeing inflation rates come down. But I think what's happened is it's not really the economy anymore. It's not even really foreign policy. Foreign policy has a role in, for instance, in Trump and Biden, just in kind of a general overall sense, and I can get more into that. But there's this kind of culture war that is seeped not just into American politics. I think you see it, you're just talking about Germany. You see that a little in Germany. You see it all over the world where it's become this hate for somebody that thinks differently. So where do I see the Republican Party right now? I think if Joe Biden had been anti-Ukraine, the Republican Party would be pro-Ukraine.
Such an important point, that, and so true. I think Ukraine has become a partisan issue, but not on the basis of the ideology of Ukraine, supporting a country that's being invaded by the arch enemy of the US, historically speaking. You'd think that you'd have cross-party support for defending Ukraine and defending the US international interests and for keeping the US at the top of the global hegemony. You'd think both sides would be surely behind that, but no. Because Biden likes it, many Republicans hate it. Because Biden wants to support Ukraine, they want to not support it. But if the shoe had been on the other foot, if this had been Trump or Republican president supporting Ukraine, those Republican voters would be well up for it.
But since Joe Biden is pro-Ukraine, this is the insanity of it. Since he's pro-Ukraine, you're seeing people use Ukraine against him because the biggest thing becomes, how do we win? I'll just say quickly, in 2015, I remember, so I was elected in 2010. 2015, I was on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I would get into arguments all the time with a fellow Republican out of California. His name's Dana Rohrabacher. I mean, to the point that we actually thought that Dana was paid by the FSB, and we were serious about that. And I would have people that would tell me, like, Adam, don't worry about Dana. He's a strange duck. Obviously, the GOP is anti-Russia. Well, look, we're just, 6, 7 years later. And it seems like I would break the Republican Party down as a quarter strongly support Ukraine, a quarter strongly oppose helping Ukraine, and 50% have no clue or are waiting to be told what to feel. So that's the moment. It's a huge opportunity for leaders.
That seems intuitively on the money, really. There are those who clearly understand the importance here, and I'd include Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, not people I'd normally be supportive of, but they're very clear and Mitt Romney, very clear in their support for Ukraine. And then there are those, your Marjorie Taylor Greens and those at that end of the spectrum who would be very much against, so maybe quarter and a quarter either way, and then 50% in the middle, wondering about other things with most of their lives and not about international politics, wondering about what's going on in their own constituency.
Leadership seems to, unfortunately, with the exception of Nikki Haley, be lacking in the GOP.
Adam, thank you so much for talking us through that. Can I ask, in your conversations with voters, what do you hear about their views, and how much of what you've just said filters down to people who, in the end up voting Republican? Yeah,
I mean, I would say from my conversations, I've been traveling the country a lot. I'm just getting off of a book tour and a speaking tour. I mean, it is very rare. I'll see divisions when I talk about things like Gaza. Obviously, I'm very pro-Israel in that, but and you'll see divisions in the crowd when you talk about that. When I talk about Ukraine, it is 95% to 100% of the audience is like, yes, Ukraine has to defend itself. I talk about, for instance, the fact that in Ukraine, I mean, here we're sitting here tearing ourselves apart in the United States and other countries. Whereas in Ukraine, you have people that think very different politically that are willing to put their lives on the line in the trenches of Ukraine. And when you talk about that, people react, I think, very well. Where my concern is
just before we go on, I think that's important. It's worth noting that he's a former serviceman himself, Adam Kinzinger. You know, he is, he's a military man. So he says something that other people have said in my threads who are Republicans, who have said, like, I'm a Republican and none of the Republicans I know are against supporting Ukraine. Everyone is for Ukraine. So I don't know where this is coming from. But there's certainly certain elements and different demographics, different geographical areas. But I mean, I assume if you are more of a MAGA style Republican who's deep into that ideology, you know, if you're a massive fan of Marjorie Taylor Greene and you listen to what she says and you think that what she says is bona fide, you know, truth, then you are going to be one of those people who ain't up for supporting Ukraine. But you're also likely not going to be someone turning up to a book tour from Adam Kinzinger, right? And so the people he talks to will be of a certain selection bias. And so, yeah, that would explain that. I mean, it'd be interesting to see what you guys in the threads, Republicans in the threads, think about how widespread support is for Ukraine amongst Republican voters.
I don't see that kind of political leadership, let's be honest, from Joe Biden, especially from Donald Trump. You don't see it, of course. But I've been critical in saying I think Joe Biden needs to be making more speeches on behalf of Ukraine. I mean,
this is what he goes on to talk about here. I was listening to it going, yeah, I agree. And I was thinking, actually, I don't agree. I'm not sure what I think here. So here's the thing. The more Joe Biden talks up Ukraine, the more partisan it becomes and the more Republicans will associate Ukraine with Joe Biden. So I actually disagree with Kinzinger. I think that he's got to pick and choose when he talks about Ukraine. That's so sad that you have to be so calculated in how you talk about what should be one of the biggest stories and biggest policy areas, certainly internationally, that you need to talk about. And yet, the more he talks about it, the more it becomes a Biden thing. And the more he sings the praises of support to Ukraine, the more it becomes a Biden thing. So on the one hand, he needs to communicate better. I think the Biden administration done a bad job of communicating the benefits for the US for assisting Ukraine. But there is a fine line. It's difficult. I'm not sure. Perhaps it will work against him the more he talks about it.
Look, the idea that the American people will lead politicians where we should go on foreign policy, that's just unrealistic. I mean, throughout history, politicians,
this is true.
It's called a leadership position for a reason. You have to lead. Politicians have been the ones to lay out a path, lay out a vision, and actually get the country, in essence, girded for war, even if we don't have to fight in it, to produce for the war. And there's been a lot of silence. So I would say that Joe Biden needs to come out and speak quite a bit more, not to convince Democrats. I think Democrats are certainly on the side of Ukraine, but to be able to paint the vision for what we're doing. One of the most misunderstood things is, what is U.S. aid? U.S. aid is actually money spent, in essence, to create better weapons for the United States and give our old stuff to Ukraine. And it's spent here in the United States. So that's the kind of information that needs to get out. Are you going to convince,
and that is really important. He does need to do that. It's the difficulty of on the one hand needing to communicate better, and on the other hand, the more you shout about it, the more certain Republicans will associate it with the Democrats or with Biden. And this is where it's so important that Republicans do that, because it's about, so much in life is about the messenger and not the message. Well, it's about the message, but it's about who delivers that as to whether it finds fertile ground. So people, I've talked about this before with in-groups and out-groups. If someone for your out-group, someone that you don't associate with, whether politically, religiously, culturally, ethnically, or whatever, comes and tells you how you should be to try and convince you out of whatever position you are in, you are much less likely to take on board what they're saying and react against it in what's called the backfire effect, right? Which is where you're entrenching your original positions more strongly, even in light of rational evidence against your position. What you need to do is, rather than have that, you need to have that, whereby, you know, you are having someone in your own in-group try and convince you a little bit to the side, and that nudges you, and then someone else then takes over, nudges you a bit more, and then eventually people within your in-group successively are moving you to a 180 shift, rather than expecting that to result in a 180 shift. So if Biden comes along and says, right, this is you, like a certain type of Republican who doesn't believe in helping Ukraine, and Biden comes along and says, this is why you should help Ukraine. Even if what Biden says is on the money, 100% correct, human psychology sucks a lot, so that this person will just entrench and say, well, you've said that and you suck, and therefore what you say sucks. That's all I need to know. I don't need to know the ins and outs of the rational kind of value of what you've said and whether it is logically sound. You've said it and you suck, and therefore what you've said sucks. And so I'm not going to believe it. Now, if a Republican in their general in-group comes and says that, then that's more likely to find as I've said, fertile ground. But the problem is, within the Republican Party, you're now getting factions and you're having power plays, so that even within the Republican Party, you have little in-groups and in-groups and in-groups. And if you have someone like an establishment Republican coming to tell you something about Ukraine, and you're from a real staunch MAGA wing, then that's still going to do that, because you're like, oh, you're just a deep state telling us what to do, and you're you know, it's your corporate backers, or it's this or it's that, and you know, I want to listen to Marjorie Taylor Greene or Matt Gaetz or whoever. And so it's still finding the right person even within the larger in-group that is going to convince people. And some people are just unable to be convinced, right? But I think there's an interesting discussion on who best to deliver information about Ukraine to, and I guess what you might want is someone. This is where someone like Elon Musk, if he was, like, reports coming out today that he's calling Euromaidan a coup, a state coup, and like the 2014 Euromaidan, like people-driven protests, a state coup, like just saying the wrong things. But if he was saying the right things, he would be a kind of person that many of these people would listen to and go, oh, okay, right, you're delivering that information that's slightly different from what I'm thinking. Okay, or maybe a military leader or something like that, someone who's somewhat more neutral, being in a position to convince people.
States. That's the kind of information that needs to get out. Are you going to convince, 90% of the Republicans when you're Joe Biden? No. Are you going to convince some? Yes. Are you going to put a narrative out there for people to grab hold of and lead this country? Yes, I think so. And that would be my criticism. I don't know if Donald Trump is savable in this, to be honest with you. And I think we have a very limited window in Congress to get aid done. I'm not hopeless, but I'm starting to get a little more pessimistic on that.
Can I ask, in your experience, Adam, what are the arguments that work, either on your colleagues in Congress or with voters? What have you found in terms of when you're making the case for the US to support Ukraine? What are the things, the points you make that actually land?
Well, look, when it comes to my colleagues, you don't even have to make the case. They all know it. They're just scared to say it publicly. Because for some reason, this has become, and not all of them again, there are some that do, but let's just look at the Republican Party for now.
So this is such a good point, is that most of the people in the Republican Party know what the right answer is here. But they don't want to say it because they fear that the base will have them, rather like what's going on with Lankford. This is being censured by the base for doing like what he sees is the right thing. Now, if you're looking on and you agree with someone like Lankford, or if it's more on Ukraine, you agree with someone on Ukraine, but you feel that if you come out and say that, you're going to be lynched by your own party locally or by Trump on Truth Social or something, then you're not going to do the right thing. People are afraid, and that's really worrying.
Mike McCall, who's a friend of mine, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, certainly pro-Ukraine, made a statement that way the other day, a little aggressive to Donald Trump, but hasn't said much more. Mike Gallagher from Wisconsin, same thing. It's like I've been trying to talk to these folks and say, look, this is a historic, as a guy that went through a historic moment on the January 6th committee, for instance, I can tell you it may cost you a little bit, but you certainly feel at peace. You can look at yourself in the mirror. And so for my colleagues, it's making the statement of like, never, it's very rare in history for a member of Congress to be able to make an impact around the world. Yeah, you can be part of a team that changes policy and makes.
This is, I really like this point, by the way. It's really rare that, as particularly as not a senator where you've got 100 and you rule for 6 years, or you have your position for 6 years, you're elected for 6 years. So you've got a longer term, you are more comfortable in thinking about international ideas. You don't have to appeal to your constituents consistently. But whereas a House of representatives, so a representative will be elected every 2 years, which means basically you're always campaigning. As soon as you're getting in, you're thinking of your next campaign and winning that next race, because it's only 2 years. So all you're doing is, well, the main thing you're doing is thinking about local issues and appeasing your base in your local area, and you're not so concerned about what's going on in the rest of the world. And what Adam Kinzinger is saying, it's very rare that you get someone, particularly as a representative, who has any impact on how things happen sort of globally. So anyway, let's return.
Make an impact around the world. Yeah, you can be part of a team that changes policy and makes a difference. You can travel. I traveled a lot, right? But let's say if you're in the GOP right now and you get a coalition of 6 of you that want to deny the Republican Party any bill to pass the floor until they promise to put Ukraine aid down for an up or down vote, you could literally change the world. Because I can tell you, if you hold to the end of that, and this is the case I'm making to these folks, if you hold to the end of that, eventually the speaker will have to put the Ukraine aid on the floor to break the logjam for any other piece of legislation, and it would pass.
This is such an interesting way of looking at it, and almost like, well, you can do that, we can do that back. The problem is, well, so first of all, it's like, it's almost as if like 6 strong MAGA Republicans can ruin the Ukraine bill from being passed or stop aid going to Ukraine. Well, actually, if you had 6 pro-Ukraine lawmakers, representatives who got together, safety in numbers, and said, we feel really strongly about this. Well, no, we are not going to, because the majority for the Republicans is so slim in the House of Representatives that actually they could wield that much power. However, those 6 would be absolutely destroyed, I think, by their base, not necessarily by the large majority of their base, but a very vocal minority. So it could be like, for example, Lankford's Oklahoma Republican Party might be an overrepresentation of MAGA style loud people shouting about that, and that could be the case. But nonetheless, those 6 getting together would always still be worried about what would happen to them.
So I guess the point I make is, guys, like, there's a moment to find courage, and that moment is now. For the American people, I think it's pretty simple. I think, Americans still get very emotionally invested in when you talk about the role we have in the world, the fact that the Iron Curtain came down, not necessarily because of American, British, German, French military, that was part of it, but largely because our ideas. The 3rd generation of people behind the Iron Curtain saw enough of Western life that they wanted a piece of it, and they tore the Iron Curtain down. Americans react very emotionally to that. We understand that we have a unique role in the world. And I think the other thing, quite honestly, is just to express to people, what is U.S. aid? The fact that, look, we have an $800 billion a year military budget. Obviously, we have an incredible military that can do incredible things. If for just the 10% of the cost of that, we can defeat one of our main foes. And look, Russia has lost 500 men a day. They lose every 5 days what America lost in 20 years in Afghanistan, and we left. So the only thing...
that's an incredible statistic. I mean, I was thinking just then, if Fox News just decided to support Ukraine overtly, right, as a position to take and to challenge people who weren't, in the same way they kind of decided to support Trump over, say, Haley. If they decided on that position, I wonder what effect that would have on the viewership and on the Republican electorate. I don't know.
thing that we can be defeated by, the Brits, the US, all of our friends, the only things we can be defeated by is if our will is defeated. And that, I think, usually does well for the American people to hear it. And that's what leaders need to speak about, I think.
Adam, so great to have you on the podcast, and thank you for listening to us for so long. I just want to pick up on something you said a moment ago about skepticism, in a sense, being able to win Trump round. Of course, there's been a lot of speculation from Ukrainians. We've discussed it on the podcast about this notion that, who knows, maybe if Zelensky is able to charm Trump, he does suddenly become an advocate for their cause. But I suppose what I'm putting to you with the remarks that you've just made, is it too late, do you think? Or is there that powerful wing of Trump's supporters who are actually so firmly anti-Ukrainian that the chances of him wanting to go against them is now it's too late, and the chances of there being that sort of reversal that some are thinking is at least conceivable has slipped away?
It's just this idea that people are anti-Ukraine in the Western world. I mean, it at one time enrages me, and at the same time saddens me deeply.
No, I don't think it's hopeless because, look, Trump, and I know him, even though he and I are not friends by any means, is the best way to put it. We know each other quite well. And I sat in the Oval Office, in fact, and convinced him it was me, Liz Cheney, and a couple others, convinced him not to leave Syria back in 17 or 18. He's very influenceable. And he's potentially, you can influence him, or specifically you can influence him when it would reflect on his reputation. So if in fact he wins,
Great
and by
point.
the way, I want to be clear, I think we need to take the risk of Trump winning very strongly. I'm a Republican, and I will be supporting Joe Biden over Donald Trump if that's not obvious. I want to make it clear here because democracy is at stake in my mind. But I don't think his victory, I hear about out of Davos, everybody's already assuming Donald Trump's going to win. I think the chances are greater than not that he loses. I think we have to take this seriously, though.
I'd agree.
And so I think, let's say he does win, though. Now, all of a sudden, if Ukraine is still defending itself, which it will be, and now it would be on Donald Trump's watch that Ukraine would potentially lose or have to surrender or have to give up a significant amount of territory. Now, all of a sudden, that reflects on Donald Trump himself. And
this is an awesome point, because for someone who is essentially a pathological narcissist, and I very strongly claim that he is, and I think most of the evidence is in. Lots of people have given psychoanalyses of him in that respect. I think that if you're going to appeal to him, you need to appeal to his own sense of identity and PR and popularity. And if you said to him, if Ukraine failed on your watch and it was your responsibility that Ukraine didn't win the war against Russia, the history books would see you as like one of the worst leaders of the US. Like that kind of approach would make Trump go, all right, no, let's win this thing, and let's win this thing all on account of me. And actually, that's a really possibly the biggest silver lining to that cloud as to what would happen in a Trump presidency in November 2024 with regard to Ukraine.
It's unfortunately, I got to say, when you're a deep narcissist, that's how you appeal to a deep narcissist, is what does this look like for you? And that's a point I make to my Democratic friends as well, is look, Joe Biden's quote unquote bubble pops. His approval rating was really high until we left Afghanistan. Now, it doesn't mean that America wanted to stay in Afghanistan. I think we made a mistake leaving there. That's my personal opinion. But Americans, sure, they wanted out, they were tired of it, et cetera. It wasn't leading the headlines, by the way. But where it affected Joe Biden was not the policy to leave. It was the fact that it felt, and it was, very chaotic. And that violates who we are as Americans. I'm sure the British feel the same way and felt the same way during that withdrawal, which is like, this isn't who we are. We're people that stick with. And so that affected, you noticed after that chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, his approval rating dropped to the 40s and really never recovered. Ukraine can do the same to Joe Biden if he's not careful. This is why he needs to be making the case. And this is why, that's very important. People may not vote on foreign policy, but it certainly adds to the background of how they feel overall about somebody's leadership potential, leadership skills.
Thank you. And just a couple more quickly on this sort of theme. Very interested as well. I'm going to put to you a question I put to another American guest we had on during this week. What is your sense of the Republican fraternity more broadly? I'm not really talking about the voters, and I'm not talking about Trump and the presidential candidates and even Congress necessarily. I'm talking about the think tanks, the policy wonks, the groups that are really the ones that build and shape an administration's agenda. And of course, they're working very, very hard at the moment. I'm very interested in your perception of the shifts going on within that fold with regard to the war in Ukraine and with regard to Europe. And my second question is a corollary to that, which is, do you think it is actually conceivable that the US would withdraw from NATO under Trump? Or do you think that would be a step too far even for them and for Donald Trump?
Well, on the NATO question, look, I think Donald Trump would like to, in theory, and I don't necessarily know if he wants to leave NATO because he really has a personal issue with NATO. It's just when you think like a narcissist, and I don't even mean this to attack him. I think he's clinically a narcissist. So we got to think of it this way. It's all about him being able to do big things and him being able to put himself at the center of attention. And I think that's what NATO's about. It's not we're America. Look, he's not doing this. Let's be clear. He's also not doing this on behalf of the American people. It's on behalf of himself. So
this is almost one of the most incisive bits of commentary he gives or analysis he gives. That the idea of coming out of NATO is anything to do with the actual intricacies of being in NATO, or the pros and cons, and he's evaluated that. It's nothing to do with that. It's a big bombastic thing that he's going to do, and look at me, I'm doing that, and that's huge, and you weren't expecting that, were you? It's all about me. And I think that is precisely what's going on there.
He may express it. He may even attempt to leave NATO, but I don't think Congress or the Senate would let him. Look, there's as bad as the situation about supporting Ukraine is maybe here domestically, there's not opposition to NATO membership. And I mean, look, NATO quite honestly has stepped up in the last few years, particularly. I mean, we see what they're doing in Ukraine. We see the increase of military spending. But what it can do is his words, even if we don't officially leave NATO and continue to participate, I mean, obviously, a president saying those words really damages an alliance and has the potential to destroy it. And, especially if Vladimir Putin would win in Ukraine, or at least freeze it to a stalemate, and then make an attempt on Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, would Donald Trump order troops? But I think what's become obvious, as a quick aside, is that even if the U.S. didn't get involved, I think Poland itself, the UK, could crush Russia. Russia's getting just walked all over, short of the nuclear weapon issue. On the larger think tank thing, yeah, this is a big concern for me because there's still a very good conservative think tank, American Enterprise Institute. I'm a fan of theirs. They think conservative policy they're kind of the last of the Mohicans, if you will, on true conservative thought. You look at like Heritage Foundation, this really, what used to be a bulwark of deep conservative thought, really has become just a fundraising mechanism and creating stuff that is just like out of control so they can go and raise money on it and have more people show up to stuff. Yeah.
I wrote an article, Carlson Heritage, Russia Follow the Money, and how the Heritage Foundation is basically under the control of money that comes from Russia through Viktor Orban and Hungary, all the way to the Heritage Foundation and Tucker Carlson as well, whose dad sits on Tucker Carlson's father sits on a lobbying he sits on a board of a lobbying organization whose main client is Viktor Orban. So Tucker Carlson's father lobbies for Viktor Orban, and then you wonder why CPAC, the Conservative Conference, has taken place in Budapest a number of times, and there's all these connections between Budapest, Hungary, and the US, and then you've got this infiltration of pro-Hungarian ideology and almost authoritarian dictatorial ideology coming through to the US, which is being itself funded by Kremlin. So Kremlin funds Viktor Orban and funds Hungary largely, and then one of the organizations that funds Heritage is funded by the propaganda department of the Orban government. And so it's just all connected. Yeah, and he's right here to call out heritage. I think that is good and proper to do so. I mean, I'm no fan of the American Enterprise Institute. I just think it's another free market kind of think tank that basically doesn't accord with any of my ideology at all. But it's interesting to hear that he puts them in a completely different category to the Heritage Foundation.
Yeah, that think tank group, like one of the things we learned as politicians is you can raise money really well on fear. One of the things we didn't learn as politicians that we should have is you can use fear sparingly, but then you have to sandwich it with optimism and vision. Otherwise, the whole country turns dark because people follow leadership. And unfortunately, since we haven't pivoted to an optimistic vision and we just continue to peddle in fear, the think tanks follow suit because that's how they make money as well.
This is such an interesting area of conversation, and he's talking about how heritage just seeks money, right? It's like any corporation. It's a corporation of ideas, right? Instead of selling cans of Coke or whatever, they are selling ideas to people, and people can fund them to get them to talk about those ideas. And if people want to fund their own sense of how, we're all going to hell in a handcart, and I hate trans, and I hate people that care about the environment, and I hate this, I hate that, and this organization is feeding me that, then I'm going to feed the money into that, and it just becomes big, some kind of big circular thing going on there. And they are just, producing stuff that they think people want to hear, but quite often, it's fear sells. We know that in the UK, the Daily Mail is a tabloid newspaper that knows that very well, and its headline, if you look at the headlines over the last decade, is just fear, 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 fear. Very little positivity, because people want to be shocked. They buy that because they want to get angry. They don't necessarily say I want to get angry, but that reactive, visceral reactive attitude that they have in reading that stuff keeps them coming back for more, and they're getting incensed. The world is terrible, and they keep buying into this narrative that's presented. And he's so correct in fear selling. And in fact, the Republicans know that better than any, because the Republicans have been traditionally much better at campaigning than the Democrats. The Republicans have campaigned on the heart over the head. And it's the same in the UK, actually. I've said this previously, when Boris Johnson got in on just 3 words: get Brexit done. That's all he did, and what that evoked in people got him elected, and the Labour Party came out with what was quite a scare quotes good manifesto. It was good because it was all kind of reasoned and funded and all this, but it was massive, and it was long, and it was all like cerebral, and it's like, you need 3 clear things to say, like, we're going to do this, this, and this, and as Tony Blair knew, education, education, education. There's a great book by Mehdi Hassan that's like how to win an argument, or whatever it is. And like, he talks a lot about the rule of 3, and about how 3 is just, the brain loves 3. So you get Brexit done, Brexit, education, education, education. But if you're going to come and try and convince people with a massive long manifesto that you kind of stumble over and then try and have to deliver that, you're not going to win their hearts. It's about winning hearts. So Republicans traditionally is all about Roe v. Wade, is about immigration, is about, these big ideas. So this is why they don't want to get the immigration bill sewn up, because then they can't campaign on it. You want to scare people with all the floods of people coming across the borders, all with their fentanyl and blah, blah, blah. And then you want to scare them with, they're coming to steal your guns, the Second Amendment, they're coming to your house and steal your guns and then murder your babies, all this kind of stuff, abortion, blah, blah, blah. It's about fear, but they do that not because any other reason, that they know that works as a campaigning policy. If you campaign on fear, you're much more likely to get people mobilized to voting for you.
Look, I think I'll say this: either the Republican Party has to lose again in November and keep losing, so it has to basically burn to save itself. And I say this again as a Republican. I call myself a Republican still because I refuse to give up. At the same time, I'm not voting Republican at the moment. They have to continue to lose, or there's going to be a conservative movement that rises up in its stead. And we can call it the flugerism movement. I don't care. You can make up any name you want, whatever you guys have weird parties in the UK, so we'll call it that. We'll call it liberal, even though it's not, whatever. But, we can make up a name for it. but there's always got to be a quote unquote liberal, a left movement, and a right movement. And right now, the right movement in this country has become ultra nationalist, and it's a very sick movement.
Another question, slightly unrelated actually to the subject we were talking
Be interested what you guys think about that. A lot of people are going to be shouting at him. A lot of people are going to hate Adam Kinzinger. A lot of Republicans out there and will be, spitting at the screen. But I'm interested in his ideas of like how, because there is this very real situation where, if you look at the polls and you look at the support Trump does have, he has a lot of support from a particular area of the Republican Party, but it's not that widespread. And in fact, then when you go to Democrats, an awful lot of people absolutely hate him. And so, as he's talking about, there's actually more of a chance he won't get voted in. And if he doesn't get voted in, and if he's lost all these elections, and even in 2016 he lost the popular vote, right? So more people voted for Hillary Clinton. It's just that he got the electoral votes for the electoral college votes. So that's how he got in. And if you look at all the data over time, then the Republican Party needs to go, okay, this isn't working. We need to reinvent ourselves because we need to get into power if that happens in November. And it'd be interesting if that was to happen, how they would reinvent themselves.
Talking about a moment ago, Adam, and thank you for your answer. I think that's really interesting on these think tanks. And I know it does sound a bit, no doubt, boring for some listeners who don't really care about think tanks. God knows I have to deal with a lot of think tanks here in Britain, and it's not the most exciting world. But it matters, and that's why I mention it. It's hugely important, as you've articulated so well. But I wanted to change subject slightly, Adam, and talk about the media. Of course, you're now a political commentator for CNN. What's your perception of the media landscape in the United States on foreign policy?
One of the most important
Europe,
questions.
On Ukraine, and more broadly. Looking at it from an outsider's perspective, it seems a very different world than the one that we know here in Britain and in Europe. Not necessarily saying that in a critical way, but it is very different. So your reflections are very welcome on that. And also as well, just interested in your perception generally about the direction of travel of media in the United States with the sort of resurgence of Trump and that sort of populism. Are you an optimist or a pessimist with regard to the media landscape?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look,
and you've got to remember the Ukraine Latest is a Daily Telegraph podcast. I mean, Francis Durnley is an avowed right winger, like anti-EU broadly. I mean, I've had arguments with him personally in the past about how he's couched things on the Ukraine Latest. So our right wing in the UK is still, quite different to how some of the right wing in the US is manifesting itself at the moment.
I guess in a way, I'm a little pessimistic. I mean, there's a lot of people will say the more media sources, the better. I understand that point of view. The less centralized the media, the better. I understand that point of view. And probably 10 years ago, I'd have told you, yes, that's great, because that brings, it's like the democratization of the media. The problem is it's not really the democratization of the media. It just creates a lot of extremism and competition. I think the UK, at least as much as I've watched, you guys do media well. I mean, there's a freedom of the press. There also seems to be a responsibility to tell the truth. You can have a spin on it, but it's not just outright lies. Malcolm Turnbull, the former Prime Minister of Australia, has become a friend of mine, and I've talked with him about the difference between media in Australia versus the United States and kind of the things that can keep the media in line better. And I think really the only thing in the United States.
Interesting, because Turnbull, if I remember correctly, has had some big contretemps with Rupert Murdoch, who owns, the Fox empire is Rupert Murdoch owned, as is not the Telegraph, but the Times and the Sun in the UK, and these big legacy media entities in Australia. And I think Turnbull, as the former Prime Minister, has come up against Rupert Murdoch, and they're putting things in place to stop the media or certain areas of the media having too much power in terms of being able to affect politics in a way that Fox News arguably has in the US. So I think Australia are probably trying to put things in place to rein in, not to overregulate, not about freedom of speech, but actually about the power media entities have to effectively lie or mold their viewership, their readership, disinform them for political gain.
States that can is lawsuits, like you've seen these lawsuits against Fox News, for instance, on the claims the election was stolen. We don't want to go down the slippery slope of everybody gets sued every time they say anything, but we also need to have some guardrails in there. So, I mean, I'm a little pessimistic, except that each new generation, when it inherits like a new technology, if you will, struggles with how to deal with that. And then it's further generations that learn how to manage and control it. So you think about Coca-Cola, for instance, when the first time Coca-Cola came out, I mean, people were drinking 2 cases of this stuff a day. Now somebody may drink 1 or 2 or even none of it because you've learned how to manage that. My hope is, my plea, I guess, is that Americans, in our case, instead of saying we're going to believe everything presented to us, it's now, okay, we're going to take a cornucopia of things presented to us and we're going to make our own educated pick. Now, that would be my optimistic view. The problem.
Sorry to interrupt him there. Talking about Malcolm Turnbull taking aim at Rupert Murdoch's angertainment. Again, it's fear sells. So it's not just about picking up the Daily Mail. It's turning on Fox News or whatever the equivalent is in Australia or the legacy media that he owns over there. But it's like selling anger. It's getting people anger. Long-standing Murdoch critic says Mogul leaves a hell of a legacy. As minister suggests he will still play a very big role, and that's the problem. I mean, he's the Liberal Prime Minister, so he's your right-wing Prime Minister, by the way, Malcolm Turnbull. He's not like a liberal lefty or anything, but he came up against Rupert Murdoch's media enterprise out there, and is still trying to sort things out on behalf of democracy in Australia.
Is we've gotten to this moment here where people just turn to the media that makes them feel good, and they don't care if it's true or not. Rupert Murdoch and Fox News is a great example of just, spoon feeding people garbage and convincing them of utter lies. So there are still great, I think CNN, for instance, is still, I'm not just saying it because they employ me. I truly believe they're a great news organization. There are some out there. The question is, will people watch it? I got a little disturbed. I think it was in Iowa. I'm sitting there on the desk. We're talking about what's going on.
And by the way, there'll be people listening who go, CNN, because news organizations become a part of your identity. So you end up being a fan of Fox because it's fed you all this stuff, and then you're in that ecosphere, that information bubble and then in this kind of feedback loop. And so an attack on Fox is an attack on you because they are the ones feeding you all of your ideas about how the world is. And so, if you attack Fox, it undoes the whole of who you are. So that's why people get really defensive. There'll be people spitting at the screen. People would have turned off this video already because, some liberal lefties like agreeing with Adam Kinzinger. But the reality is we have a problem with our news sources because they aren't news anymore. They're infotainment, and it's about, feeding people disinformation to achieve an agenda that they have set. And as Adam Kinzinger said, one of the best ways of changing this is actually some big lawsuits. What happened to Fox is they changed the way they actually were happy to disinform people over the Dominion and Smartmatic claims. When they were done, when they lost in court or settled out of court, they were going to lose big time. That's the only way to change someone like Rupert Murdoch, unfortunately, is to hit him in the pocket.
Iowa, like it mattered, didn't. And I just remember thinking, we're talking about Donald Trump now as a normal candidate. We're talking about his campaign and what his people are doing. And it's like, this is a guy that tried to overthrow the U.S. government. And so where I worry about where the media is going is, do they have to now talk about Donald Trump as a normal candidate when he's the nominee? I don't have a good answer for that. You guys as media folks may be able to answer that better. I guess the best thing you can do is just continue to call out lies when he tells them. But it's a weird thing for me to sit there and talk about this absolute traitor to America as if he's a normal man running for president. Because in my mind, he deserves to be behind bars, and very well maybe.
I think the technology might be too much. I don't think, Adam, you're hearing James, are you?
No, I didn't get it.
Okay. Well, thank you, James, for the question. This is what James wants to ask. He says, German politicians tell me they, and wider Europe, will need to focus more on self-reliance in terms of defence if Trump wins, that they can't rely on the Americans. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, look, I mean, I think Gosh, I wish I could say no. You can always rely on the Americans. That would make me feel better to say. I think it's always important, first off, just for Europe to not need the United States anyway, because if you can defend yourself, that's a good thing. I mean,
Yeah,
obviously we
agree.
have a special ability. We have an amazing military. I served in it for 22 years. I'm proud of it, and I do think we'll always be there for our friends in Europe. But that said, what's the insurance policy? Just be able to fight the wars as well the best you can yourself. I think, look, if Donald Trump, let's say he wins, and again, I still put the chances of that as much smaller, but let's say he wins. It's not like over that 4 years, we're going to become aligned with Russia and we're going to create Russia, US, NATO. Like, that's not going to happen. It's going to be a crazy time like the last 4 years. And then we're going to correct. Look, here's my optimism. 2028 is actually going to be an amazing year in America. And I am truly optimistic that the new American century is coming because it's going to be two parties with all new candidates, all new blood, all new generation, all new ideas. And we need that at this moment. So I don't think we're going away. But yeah, I think it's important for Europe to be able to defend itself, to be able to continue to grow. But if it's this idea like this, look, I've traveled the world in my 12 years in Congress. It's not just now. Every time, I mean, even under Obama, we'd go travel somewhere and it's like, is the US abandoning us? And it's like, no. Obama really screwed up in Syria hugely, by the way. And everybody was thinking that America was pulling out of the world. We didn't. This is what happens every year. And some of you that have been around a while know this. It's always a question. But defend yourself too. And I think we'll be here to help.
There's a few more bits and pieces to add to that. He answered a few more questions, but I think that's probably enough. I know that he's a divisive figure for many of you in American politics. And I know some of you won't like me saying the things I was saying, but this is there's a meta discussion there in what he was saying about, we need to hear differing opinions and not just sit in our own information bubbles. And, if we shut down differing opinions, then we are inoculating ourselves from ever changing our minds. And if you're going to say, I'm never going to change my mind, then what does that say about your approach to finding out truth in the world? Because you're saying no matter what the truth is, what I know now is what I need to know, and I'm never going to change my mind from that. And so, I'm just going to sit and watch this media, outlet, and it's going to feed me what I need to know, and that what I need to know is therefore the truth, and yada 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 yada. I'm never going to entertain any idea that any of this could be wrong, because if I do, then I have to deconstruct my entire identity, and I can't do that. So we need to all the time be trying to get information from a variety of sources. Now, I know I am biased and I take things from a particular set of sources. I know that. I mean, having said that, we've just listened to a right-wing news media source from the UK for the last almost an hour now. And this guy is a Republican. So, hopefully I'm showing you that we can take ideas from different places, and just we need to think about it. I may not be right, in what I say, in which case I need to know how I am wrong, and you guys need to tell me, and then hopefully, like the scientific method, we arrive at a closer and closer towards a truth about reality. But if you just stick with what you think you know and say that's true, and anyone that even remotely criticizes any idea of this, any of the people or the news sources or anything to do with my worldview, then that is blasphemy. If that's blasphemy, you can't say it and I can't hear it. That is not good for the mind. That is not good for having a sound grasp on reality. Anyway, let me know what you think. Please like, subscribe and share. Take care. Speak soon.